Hello everybody and welcome to episode 5 of Jim 1537's Metaphysical Tools for Transformation podcast. As always, I'm joined by my wife Meremysitc.
Hello everybody. Today we're going to talk about a fascinating subject. Today we're going to talk about our spiritual path and the healing tools that we use upon our journey. And our spiritual path is something that we hear a lot about in spiritual circles. So Jim, I thought it'd be helpful, again, if you would start us out by explaining to us, define spiritual path.
I'd love to. First off, all of us, whether we realize it or not, are on a spiritual path. So whether we're cognizant of that fact or not, everybody's here on a spiritual path. Whether we believe in spirituality, whether we don't, we're nonetheless on a spiritual path. In today's episode, we're going to talk about when we become cognizant of our spiritual path. What are our dreams, our goals? What are we trying to do in that spiritual path from a subjective point of view, where we have made a decision to embrace a spiritual journey, embrace our spiritual path, and what that entails.
Now, when we talk about this, how do we get started? Because obviously this isn't just a metaphysical version of what are you going to be when you grow up.
Right. Well, I think there's several things that we can do. First off, the easiest, and this is one that is quite ubiquitous in culture. The easiest, so let's start with that, is to find our passion, to find our dream, to be aware of what motivates us from inside, what in a sense lights us up and makes us feel invigorated and alive. However, that's not the only thing that is going to give us our spiritual path. It's not that simple. So besides the idea of finding what we feel, the idea of trying to become a better person, being cognizant of how we impact on others, looking at what God and nature support or don't support, kind of the old concept of jamming a round peg into a square hole where it's not flowing versus, say, flying in an airplane where the wind is at your back and the wind helps to carry you. I think that's important, to be aware that what we may decide to do may also not last. That part of it may be struggle. Part of it may involve suffering. Part of it may involve being prepared for different sources of input to find that path. So the simple answer to it is that there's many different ways that we find our spiritual path, but I think for each of us it's unique. But the most simple way is to start with what we feel inside, but yet to also be aware of the other factors and other options that help to define and articulate that path.
But if it's not as simple as just, say, setting a goal and doing a to-do list and then checking things off until we get there, what other elements do we need to consider in that? Do we need to look at? Do we choose the path or does the path choose us?
I think it depends. Both situations can apply. I mean, if we look at it this way, from a higher spiritual level, our higher self, our divine self, the God within, is always at the foundation of what happens. But again, it's not that simple because we may have a lesson to discover that path. That may involve struggle. Also, that out of the blue, oftentimes God and nature show us what our path is. Divine intervention, of course. Oftentimes, that there's different things that we may have for a portion of our life that are the path, and then we no longer need it, in the sense that we may go to high school, but then we eventually go to college. So I think we have to be aware of all of the different factors as much as we can that help to let us know how we're going to find that path. But I think first and foremost that we want to be wide awake. We want to be alert. We want to look at the fact that sometimes we're choosing it and sometimes it's choosing us, and sometimes it's a combination of both. Again, depending on the karma, the life lessons, and the passage we're in our life.
So, in a sense, you're saying from what we call a Zen perspective, we're trying to be mindful and we're trying to be aware of what our path is.
Absolutely. We have to be, because we can't just continue to live as if we're bouncing off the walls, where we perceive that things are just happening and we don't know why, and we have no ability to know why, or no effect on it. We have to get out of that thinking by being mindful, and part of that is being aware of the spiritual path and ultimately starting to look toward the different variables of how that path comes about. Of course, we have to be mindful of it.
Do we have expectations about our spiritual path that we need to push out of the way? I mean, sometimes do we think there should be a struggle, or that if we're on the right path, there should not be a struggle? Are there expectations that we need to look at?
I think that's a really good point. And I think that those expectations have to be looked at, because sometimes our expectations are dead wrong. Sometimes they're a mixture of both wrong and right, and sometimes they're right. So say, for example, we might have the expectation that if we're on our spiritual path, that it will be easy. There will be no struggle. That's usually very false, because struggle is a part of the physical dimension. In other words, a life is not lived without suffering and struggle. And so the idea of expectations that we have can be very misleading. And I think you bring up a good one, that I think a lot of people think, well, if it's my spiritual path, it's going to be so easy. Everything's just going to fall together. And certain aspects of a spiritual path will indeed fall together. We will all experience those magical moments on that spiritual path. However, sometimes suffering is a part of the spiritual path. Struggle is a part of the spiritual path. Patience, endurance, believing, not believing, divine intervention, and all of those variables. So we have to be mindful also of not having rigid expectations, because those expectations may or may not be accurate, applicable, or right.
Recently, in one of the last podcasts, we talked about the concept of self-identity and perception. And could you address for a moment how those issues affect how we view our spiritual path, our own, say, our desires, our emotions? How do those cloud the issue of our perception? How does that affect it?
Well, I think it greatly affects it, because how we perceive ourselves to be, what we perceive ourselves to be, has a lot to do with, from our own personal perspective, how we see, architect, and desire to let our spiritual path unfold. I think what's important is that when we look at our self-perception, is it in harmony with divine love? Is it not? The more in harmony it is with divine love, the more closely linked, in most instances, it will be to our higher spiritual path. Meaning, if our self-perception is that we're an inadequate person, we're an unworthy person, let's say that's the way we feel, whether we admit it cognitively or not, but that's really what we feel, then it's going to be hard to be able to have an identification or a resonance with a path that involves abundance, that involves deserving, that involves receiving love, right? Love from another person, love from the universe, love in any form. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Can we do it on our own? Do we need other people? How individual is this choice for us? I mean, I think there's two aspects to this. One, is it the same for everyone?
Well, of course it's not the same for everyone. And that's the point where one-size-fits-all slogans, if you will, don't apply to everybody's individual journey. It's quite the opposite. It's very unique to each person, meaning my lessons are not your lessons, and so-and-so's lessons are not your lessons or my lessons. However, there could be interconnected themes with people that we're close to, like, say, lovers, family members. Some of those lessons may be intertwined, but of course, it's individual. Now, as far as doing it on our own, even though it's an individual journey in a sense that we're making, I think that it is highly unlikely that we could do it on our own. I think the concept of doing it on our own is self-sabotaging, because of the idea that there's a certain level of enlightenment that we're seeking. We don't have it at a certain point. So we need other people who have that enlightenment to assist us in manifesting this divine spiritual path, whatever that may be for us. Say, for example, a good therapist, a good spiritual advisor. If you're more conventional in your spiritual approach, a good minister, a good church. But it's the idea that having somebody who is enlightened more than yourself, especially in the areas you're looking to manifest, is very good. And I think, of course, that doing it on our own, and that being really a very self-sabotaging thing, brings up this point, that not just one person, but others as well. So, of course, we can't do it on our own. We need a multitude of people and different tools, and those, types of people, the amount of people, the tools that we use, it's variable depending again on the individual path and the time frame that the person is embarking on this journey. What are they doing when they're 10 or 20 or 30 or 80? Because that may vary too, because it isn't as if the spiritual path is just static. Of course, it's unfolding and ever growing in the same way that if we were driving a car down a road, of course, we're going from one point to another.
Well, it seems that, people have expectations about this. I think we've all, we've heard the story of the Buddha, how he sat underneath the tree until he reached enlightenment.
Mm-hmm,
right.
Mm-hmm.
So we sort of think if we look inward enough that we may find our answers. And it's a little more complicated than that, isn't it?
Yes. Let me say this, that both aspects apply. Of course, part of this is internal. So it isn't just like we're looking at the therapist and the psychic and the spiritual advisor and our mother and our best friend. That's part of it, but part of it is internal as well. And I think both need to work ideally like a hand in glove, like a really good fit. So of course, part of it is going to be internal, where we're aware of what our intuition says, what our higher guidance says, what we're feeling and resonating with, hopefully at our deepest and most highest core. But it's not just an internal journey in most applications. Again, I don't like to make an all statement, but say 99% of the time, it won't just be where we're metaphorically the island and we're just on our island and becoming connected to God through that island, that there is a very interactive process with it that entails both our internal process and external support as well.
And living in the world.
I think that that's true. I mean, again, there may be certain people whose path is to sit on a mountaintop for 70 years.
Sure.
But I think it's just so not applicable to most of us. So say for almost all of us, I think that's important that we do try to live in the real world and apply our spiritual path to what is happening, quote unquote, in the real world, because then it's tangible, it's real, it's interactive, and it's evolutionary versus just being internal, which allows us to go so within that we may not deal with things from a centered perspective because it's, you could say, the world according to Jim, the world according to Johnny, the world according to Susie, that at a certain point that world could be ripe with subjective distortion.
And that's not where we want to be, because that's not a true spiritual path.
I don't think it's a good place to be. And the reason I don't is because, again, if we're going away from the divine and going more into skewed subjectivity, I think it takes us away from being on a pathway of light and of love. I don't think it's a good place to be. I mean, now conversely, part of that disconnection could indeed be a part of our path, part of our learning. Anything could be part of our learning experience. I mean, no matter what it is, anything could be a lesson. But I'm saying if we're ideally trying to manifest our highest possible spiritual path, I think it's a great rule of thumb to not make it the world according to Jim.
Well, we've talked about this being in certain ways a very personal and individual process for each of us, because my process may be different than your process. So it seems like we're looking at several variables depending on what our path is and what the spiritual goal of each pathway is. For instance, if my pathway is to become famous as a writer, and your pathway is to get past something that happened in your childhood, we're going to need different tools.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. This is, again, where generic answers are oftentimes not very helpful. Because let's say the tools we would use to get past something in our childhood: a therapist, a spiritual counselor, friends and family who understand and love us if they can be those people for us. Possibly self-help books, meditation, affirmations, forgiveness, gratitude, potentially yoga, even physical fitness could help. A healthy diet, not being indulgent in alcohol and drugs. So all of those things, and I'm not saying that somebody should use every single one of those tools. necessarily, but kind of, again, a mix and match that would work for that person. Some people use one thing, some people use another in a combination. And then if you're going on a pathway of being say, a famous writer or a famous author or artist, that would have some complementary elements and some different elements. Say that in that path, a great writing teacher, a class that deals with creative writing, other writers, a writer's workshop, critique group, okay? The idea of going to seminars, the idea also where, say, spiritual guidance and therapy could potentially be helpful as well, because that could also help the person aspiring to be a great and famous writer as part of their spiritual path to become more in tune with their center, their core.
But it doesn't sound as necessary as, say, if I was trying to get over something from my childhood. I would think I would need a therapist more if I was trying to get...
I think perhaps that's true. I think that's a good point. But I'm saying that I think it could still be helpful even if one's working on the path of being a writer, or say another, vocationally oriented goal, which is still tied into our spiritual path. But I agree that if there's something that is really just a core of an emotional pain that is very traumatic and difficult, certainly the concept of therapy, whether that's spiritual counseling, conventional therapy, or a combination of both, becomes essential.
But I think it sounds like what you're saying is no matter what the goal is, don't prejudge what it is that you need, what tool that you need, because you may be surprised.
I think that's a good point. I think that you shouldn't prejudge it. And again, it's going to be different for different people. Say if we even use the idea of getting past something in childhood, some people have internalized that trauma as suppressing it so much that they can't even feel it. They can't feel it. I've had that experience with different people that I've counseled myself, where they know something happened to them, whether sexual abuse or something horrible from a parent or a family member, let's say. They know it, they remember it, but they're not emotionally connected to it. So that's a different process to help open that energy up, to be able to get through the barriers, to get into the core of that actual energy. That ties into the concept that you can't heal it unless you can feel it. And that would apply to that person. Now, say there's another person, they're bouncing off the walls. They're acting out the emotion. They're volatile. They're explosive. They feel it every day. That may be a different process, even therapeutically, where it would deal more with, say, limiting the type of emotional expression. In other words, instead of screaming and overreacting, more moderate approaches in terms of curbing some of those emotions. So even within, say, emotional healing of a trauma, there's different ways that it works for different people, and it should not be prejudged, ever.
It sounds like for most of us, we sort of see, you mentioned at the beginning that we are already obviously on a spiritual path.
Mm-hmm.
Usually, it seems like most of the people that I've known have kind of seen the beginning of their spiritual path as the time that they began working consciously with that path.
Okay. Uh-huh.
Okay. And are there any things that are common to everyone who is trying to work on their spiritual path? I mean, is there something, I've seen people think like, you need to go do psychic development classes, you need to study yoga, you need to study the tarot, you need,
whatever that is, yeah. I don't think so. I don't think that one could say that there's, say, a absolute commonality. For some people, it could be a death of a parent. And then they find out that that's opened up a spiritual journey for them. For some people, it could be a very simple cognitive choice. I want to become closer to God. For some people, it could be the desire to develop spiritual skill sets or gifts. They want to be, say, a Reiki master, or they want to work with becoming a healer. I don't think it's fair to say that there's just one way that this happens. There's many ways that it happens. But I think there's two ways we can essentially, maybe three ways we could look at it. That we're all on a spiritual path at all times, whether we know it or not. Then the points where we have a juncture or a crossroads where we become cognizant of a spiritual path through a choice. Then there's also where we don't realize it at the time, but we become embarking upon a spiritual journey through a very important, whether positive or negative, circumstance that transforms us into a spiritual journey at that moment as well.
Are there necessarily spiritual gifts that are associated with being on a spiritual path? Do you have to manifest a spiritual gift if you're on a spiritual path?
No, I don't think you have to at all. I think that for some people they do and some people they don't. Again, it would depend on the karma, the dharma, the life lessons. Say, for example, is everybody on a spiritual path need to develop their psychic ability? No, they don't need to. For some people, they serve the poor. Some people, they develop intuition. Some people learn healing. Some people pray. Some people work toward forgiveness. Some people work towards simply trying to serve a productive purpose in the community. I think that very much varies. And I don't think that there is any sense of gifts that are necessary at all to develop that spiritual path as being essential. It depends person by person, but certainly it's not essential.
Or seeing love as a spiritual gift. St. Paul referred to love as a spiritual gift. And I've met people like that who cared for the elderly or did something where they are so loving and so non-judgmental that you just know they're on a spiritual path.
Sure, and I think that at that foundation of love, and not love in the way most people think of love as a sort of attached, passionate, sexually driven kind of an experience. If we're referring to love in the pure, godlike, unconditional sense, the way that a mother loves her newborn child as she's looking at the newborn child, that sense of God love, that can only help. It can only be good. And certainly I feel that when a person is embarking upon that kind of journey of unconditional love, that's going to be a wonderful thing. But again, a lot of people substitute subjective love for unconditional love.
Right.
I've seen people who have said, oh, I love this person so much that whatever they do to me, I'm going to still love them, which is a thinly veiled excuse to accept an abusive relationship.
Right.
They hit me, I still love them. They cheated on me, I still love them. They said I was ugly, I still love them. And that's obviously not really about unconditional love in the way that we're speaking of it here. That a lot of people are able to substitute one thing for another to achieve their own distorted rationalizations, which is very common in the physical plane because of our distorted perception. So if we're saying love in an unconditional way, like say serving people, helping people, being non-judgmental, of course that always accentuates the goodness of our spiritual path. It's wonderful.
It is a wonderful thing. It is. Often you've used the phrase, and I have too, where we talked about nature supporting a decision. In terms of our spiritual path, how important is that?
Well, I think it's extremely important. And I think extremely important, again, in more complicated ways than we think. Say, for example, if something happens on Earth, to some degree, it has to be supported by nature. No matter how arrogant or egotistical we get, like, I've done this, I did this, I achieved this, that in some way nature has to support it. So oftentimes nature will support it straight away, which is really a strong indicator that this is what we're supposed to be doing. In other words, if nature supports it separate from our efforts, in addition to our desires and wants, it's usually a pretty good indicator that this is what we're supposed to be doing. Sometimes, though, nature is not supporting it totally because we're supposed to struggle. We're supposed to struggle. Not that we've just taken on a sort of an absurd struggle that just contributes to our pain and suffering needlessly, but that part of the nature not supporting it is so that we learn a lesson, perhaps of patience, of persistence, of diligence, of making the journey, of hanging in there. And then other times, nature won't support it at all, which would mean, hey, we're not supposed to be doing this, at least at this time. And sometimes when nature really doesn't support it much, it could also mean that maybe we need to think of extricating ourselves from it, but it's not at that point where it's clearly defined at that time that we're supposed to leave it. So there's a lot of variables with nature supporting it, but I think as a overall truth, it's hugely important.
But it seems like that if the lesson, again, this would depend on what the lesson is.
Sure.
If the lesson is that we're supposed to struggle with wanting this and not getting it,
right,
that nature may not support it. Or may support it just enough to keep us interested.
Well, nature would support it at least to a point. And what I mean by that is that if we're supposed to go through the lesson, that certainly we can't go through the lesson if nature doesn't support it at all. Let's say if we were supposed to live through a really bad disease, that nature would have to support us being alive to be able to go through that. So if nature didn't and we had left this world, well then of course that's a different sort of a ball game. But I think that, again, it's more complicated how much nature supports it, because we'll even find that at times nature may support part of our path strongly, and then another time not. Even if we look at a simple example like somebody who is serving the poor, and that's what they're doing. Now, at another point, nature may not support it because they may be supposed to do something else, or it may not be something they're supposed to be putting as much attention to yet, or even that they've done it and are not supposed to now.
Right.
So I'm saying that clearly whatever nature supports or doesn't support it to whatever degree is hugely important in our spiritual journey and on our spiritual path, but it can't just be looked at as a one-dimensional answer. But I think the easiest way to look at it is that when nature really strongly supports something, it in most instances indicates a very strong green light. There's a however to that, though, and this again ties into human rationalization, which is so common, especially nowadays, is that because we want something so badly, whether it's a relationship or somebody, we can architect a false reality that nature is supporting it. I can't stop thinking about him. He called me. He wanted to have sex with me. I'm talking to him again. And that may not really be nature supporting it to anywhere near the degree that we want it to be. Obviously, nature would have to support it to some point for there to be a phone call. But there's a difference between a dime and $1 million, and they're both money. So there's a difference between this small, infinitesimal level of nature supporting something versus really nature giving it the green light. And I think the best way to tell that is to try our best to step back from our own subjective desires the best that we can and say, what is nature supporting in addition or separate from my subjective desires and efforts? And to also seek the advice of others who are enlightened and dispassionate about our situation to see what their input says as well.
When you talk about nature supporting a decision at one point and maybe not supporting it so much at another point, is it a good idea for us to periodically kind of review where we're at on our path?
I think it's a great idea. And I think it's one of those things that it may seem a little odd in terms of where we're at as a society. Now, from a societal point of view, yes, we should review where we're at externally. Have we made more money? Have we lost more weight? Have we met a wonderful person? Have we got a job promotion? Viewing it as externals. But I would say, and those things are of course valid and fine, but I would say that we should also do it from a more internal, what would be considered abstract perspective, but from a spiritual perspective, very real. Say, for example, that we should look, am I more at peace now than I was a month ago? Am I going to bed easier and sleeping easier than I was a month ago, or is it harder? Am I experiencing more peace and harmony in my relationships with family, with friends, with co-workers, or not? How are my habits regarding eating? How are my habits regarding possibly alcohol and drugs? Different things like that, I think, are very, very good. Do I feel more forgiving? Because I've seen this experience over and over again with people I've read for as well as with myself. The more we forgive, the lighter we will feel. I mean, there's a tangible way to look at that. There's a correlation. The more grateful we are, the more grateful we're going to have to be grateful for, right? Not to sound tongue-twisted, but in other words, it's like a snowballing process. So I think that we should monitor, not obsessively or neurotically, our spiritual path and how we're evolving in that way. And I think that we should do it, say, whether it's weekly or monthly or seasonally, but certainly not yearly. I think that's too long in most instances. I think daily might be a little bit overreaching, depending. I mean, we could say, okay, each day do I feel a little better? But I think if we have a little bit of a time break between evaluations, it gives us some perspective. So I would say weekly, monthly, seasonally, in general is very good. But again, of course, that would change person by person and situation by situation.
As we're bringing this to a close and we look at the concept of spiritual path, are there any commonalities?
Well, here's the thing that I would say. There's not nearly as many commonalities as people would like to think, but there are some, and I would like to talk about those. There's always a lesson. Always. So in other words, nothing that happens in life is without a spiritual lesson. Even if we look at a simple example of somebody being 18 and becoming hugely famous as a celebrity. And of course, what would society say about that? Look at that person. They have everything, that spoiled brat, blah, blah, blah. Okay, very, very short-sighted way of looking at it. Because the lesson may be, you're going to be given this fame, and then your lesson is, how do you handle it?
How do you keep it?
How do you keep it? How do you maintain it? How do you lose it? And as we've seen with young people who become famous, that it's oftentimes a train wreck in progress, sadly. Then, in other instances, the lesson could be a struggle to get there. The idea that we have to learn that sometimes we have to accept curveballs. That sometimes the divine universe will throw us a curveball. Has nothing to do with our subjective desires or even something that we have cognitively
or how well we're doing.
Or how well we're doing. Right. That sometimes we may start out being an atheist, okay, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with whatever our path is at a given point. Then 20 years later, we may have a spiritual awakening as a curveball. That's part of it too. And to always remember that no matter what we are, who we are, how good looking we are, how rich we are, how famous we are, how much, we suffer, that lessons are always hard. Spiritual lessons are always hard. And what I call pop culture spirituality, watered down, superficial spirituality, those kind of concepts are not really so talked about. It's more like, you can have everything, you can have anything you want.
Say a few affirmations.
And it's sad because then people believe it. And of course, we have to try to manifest, and there are varying levels that we can manifest, and we're not going to get off on that tangent right now. But it's important to know that lessons are always hard, but that through learning our lessons, we certainly do spiritually grow. But in the sense of being on a spiritual path, what I would recommend to virtually everybody is to do your best to rise to the level of your divine place in the universe. No matter who you are, what you've done, each of us have a irreplaceable, unique, and special divine place in the universe. Please don't just walk the path, but become the path.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Do you want to remind everybody about your book?
I would certainly love to. If you haven't picked it up yet, please get my book, Why the Law of Attraction Isn't Working for You. It's an ebook. You can get it on Amazon for the Kindle, iTunes, and wherever ebooks are sold.
And if anyone is interested in contacting you for a reading or a consultation?
If you'd like to have a private session with me, which is specifically tailored to your individual needs and concerns, you can contact me at jim1537.com, and we can arrange a session from there. Everybody, thanks so much for tuning in. It's been great sharing this moment with you. Take care.
Bye-bye, everybody.